Buluvinaka, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Vice President, Ms. Christine Burley, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, observer country members, and also various observer NGOs. It gives me much pleasure to be here this afternoon. I've got written in my notes here to welcome you on behalf of the Fijian government, but also welcome and a goodbye too. I understand, of course, you've been welcomed by His Excellency the President, who was here with you yesterday. But it gives me much pleasure to be here, and the fact that we have the President of our country here at the opening does go to give you a very strong message that the Fijian government is very much not just cognizant of, but also very much committed to the adherence of international humanitarian law. From a philosophical perspective, I think generally we tend to, in the international space, ignore when it comes to conventions, etc., or I should say conversely, place more emphasis on more, I suppose, more popular conventions such as ICCPR and ISCRA, etc., where people have a lot more, currency with those conventions. That is pushed a lot more, to the detriment, I think, at times of international humanitarian law. That is always seen as the last resort. Indeed, it is always seen as something that is more of an afterthought. But as we've seen, for example, in the Pacific, and indeed I can speak for Fiji, many of our development partners generally talk about ratifying the ICCPR or ratifying the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. However, the reality is that all these conventions are very much interlinked. They must be given equal prominence and indeed equal attention, and indeed equal attention to the fact that we need to incorporate that in our domestic laws too. The reality is that many Pacific Islanders would probably argue that things like international warfare, etc., is very far removed from Fiji. But of course, humanitarian law also does take into account, as has been discussed, climate change. Climate change is the most existential threat to Pacific Islanders as we speak. Indeed, climate change can lead to disputes because if we have islands sinking beneath the waters, submerging beneath the waters, we have issues such as where do you measure the EEZs from? Do you actually recognize those countries as countries? Where does the 200 economic zone start from, or does it end at? These are many issues. We have a country in Fiji, a country in the Pacific that has bought land in Fiji for food security purposes. Now, if those people were to be moved to a country like Fiji, Fiji is actually, through the Honorable Prime Minister, made a commitment that we will take people from submerging islands into Fiji and give them refugee status. There's a whole heap of legal issues that actually emanate from that. What will be their status? And as I said, what will be the status of their country should the country or part of the country actually submerge beneath the waters? I think these are very, very critical issues. So therefore, the point being that we need to take international humanitarian law very, very seriously. Some of us, of course, have ratified conventions. Some countries probably have ratified more international humanitarian law conventions than others. And I think the point of this gathering, the first roundtable discussion for the Pacific, is to be able to collaborate with each other, to learn from each other and see where some of us may be ahead of others and how we can help them and bring them along with us, and perhaps also learn from each other in respect of what we can do better and how we can perhaps, if some countries have domesticated international law into their own sovereign laws, then how we can adopt those too. In Fiji's case, for example, the Treaty on the Arms Trade, we have, of course, going through the various processes now. Of course, the RFMF is one of the key stakeholders, also needs to review that. We already have, for example, the National Security Council that has the mandate to be able to assess these types of conventions and how we can work them through into domestic laws. Of course, under our Constitution also, any international treaty must be approved by Parliament. And so when the treaties are verified by the Cabinet, through the Security Council, through Cabinet, and then presented to Parliament, then by law, constitutionally provided, there is actually a committee, parliamentary committee, that then actually sits and then receives opinions or invites opinions from members of the public. They go through the public consultation process, and then they make a recommendation to Parliament, and then of course then Parliament decides whether we should ratify that particular convention, and indeed if we are going to ratify the convention, should there be any provisos to that or reservations to any of the conventions we may sign. So this is, for example, a process that we do have in Fiji. I'm sure that some of the similar countries in the Pacific may have similar processes, but again, we can learn from each other. We were, of course, the first country to ratify the Paris Agreement in the world. And of course, that is a very, very important milestone for us. Today, we are now on the brink of assuming the presidency of COP23, which will, of course, commence in about a week's time. The Honorable Prime Minister is leading the presidency. And as we've seen in the past few weeks, in particular, we had pre-COP here a couple of weeks ago, or actually only about a week ago here in Nadi. You can see so many issues actually have emanated from our ability to engage at the climate change front. The Pacific Island countries, of course, have almost negligible carbon footprint, but they are the cold face of climatic changes. They are the ones who actually have to move their villages to higher grounds. There's changes in the ocean temperature levels. Some areas, fish stocks have declined. We have coral bleaching. It actually is affecting an entire ecosystem, which in turn has an impact on people's lives. It affects people's way that they live their lives, how they're able to access, sustain livelihoods. On the other hand, of course, it has an impact on a person's dignity. And I think it brings me back to the point about international humanitarian law. If you were to leave aside all the conventions, the reality about international humanitarian law is to be able to fundamentally treat the other human being, your fellow human being, with respect and dignity, irrespective of the circumstances in which you engage with them in. So even if you're at war with the other side, even if you're fighting the other side, there is a particular level of humanity, a particular level of dignity, a particular level of decorum that must be maintained at all times. And that's what international humanitarian law fundamentally is all about. And so if we are able to understand that and inculcate that way of thinking with our people, with your own citizens in your own respective countries, so when they do go abroad as peacekeepers, when they do go abroad as perhaps private personnel serving as security guards, they will actually have that sense as to what exactly humanitarian law is all about. Because at the end of the day, you can have all the best conventions, but if you have a person on the ground who does not understand and respect that particular philosophy or principle, they will be the ones who will be at the forefront of breaching those conventions, those principles that we actually set aside to ensure that everybody actually adheres to those. I'd like to thank, of course, the International Committee of Red Cross for this partnership, for this relationship. We look forward to working to them a lot more closely. We're quite keen to, of course, be able to facilitate any regional dialogue that we may want to have, that we have now the advent of technology, because we have people who have access to information, and people who suddenly actually are inundated with information that they have not had before. Much of that information actually sometimes gets translated in a very negative fashion. And the technology also gets misused, or abused, I should say. So there's a lot more opportunity for people to be able to create a lot more chaos, to be able to use that misinformation to try and create conflict, actually, for their own personal political agendas. And we have to, again, be a lot more vigilant because of that. And a lot of it starts at home, in your own countries. And I think in Fiji's case, we have, of course, seen that. We need to be able to ensure that we are able to have very strong domestic laws to be able to prevent the spread of that type of propaganda, that type of thinking, that could eventually lead to a situation where we could actually have breaches of humanitarian law. So, ladies and gentlemen, with those few words, I'd like to thank you once again. I'd like to thank ICRC once again for this partnership, and we look forward to working together with you, and I wish all of you a bon voyage. Thank you very much. Vinaka.
Yeah.